The harbor was alive with light. Strings of yellow bulbs swayed above the pier, laughter spilling from open doors, music crackling through old speakers. Somewhere a radio played a cheerful tune about love and summer. The smell of fried food and sweet soda drifted through the cold evening air as people gathered to celebrate the town's annual waterfront festival. Just beyond the glow, the water turned black. At the far end of the dock, where the lights no longer reached, Walter Hayes, 64 years old, stood alone beside his small fishing boat. The wood beneath his boots was damp and splintered. His hands, thick, scarred, permanently smelling of salt and iron, trembled slightly as he untied the rope. Walter's back was curved from decades at sea. His knees ached with every step, especially when the cold crept in. A dry cough burned his chest, one he tried to ignore. He wore the same faded jacket he'd owned for years, its zipper broken, the pockets stretched thin. Tonight, celebration meant nothing to him. In his jacket pocket was a folded notice from the utility company, $486.32 overdue, final warning. In his wallet, $12.17, and an old photo that had lost most of its color. His freezer at home held nothing but ice. Walter had planned to fish longer that morning, but his strength gave out. The boat rocked gently as he checked the net one last time. Inside it lay a single fish, not large, not impressive, just enough to cook once, just enough to quiet the hunger that had followed him for weeks. As fireworks cracked in the distance, flashes of red and gold reflecting off the water, Walter remembered another kind of noise, sirens, years ago, a hospital hallway that smelled of bleach, a hand slipping from his grasp. After that day, the house had grown unbearably quiet. Bills piled up. Friends stopped calling. The sea became the only place that still spoke to him. He lifted the fish, its scales cold and slick against his palm. "This is it," he whispered, more to himself than to the water. Behind him, laughter rose. Ahead of him, darkness stretched wide and endless. Walter didn't know, before the night was over, this single fish would become the most important choice of his life. Walter wrapped the fish in old newspaper and placed it carefully in a small cooler. The plastic lid creaked as he shut it, the sound sharp in the quiet beyond the festival's reach. He sat on the edge of the dock for a moment, letting his feet dangle above the dark water. The cold crept up through his boots. His body ached in places he no longer remembered injuring. His hands throbbed from arthritis, fingers swollen and stiff, nails cracked from years of salt and neglect. Every breath came with a faint rattle, like sand trapped deep in his chest. The clinic had warned him months ago, early-stage lung disease. Treatment required medication he couldn't afford. $189 a month, even with partial assistance. He laughed bitterly at the thought. Walter hadn't always lived this way. There was a time when the harbor lights had felt welcoming, when he'd walked these same planks with a straighter back and quicker steps. Back when his boat was newer, his nets heavier with fish, his pockets fuller. Back when someone waited for him at home. Her name had been Ellen. She loved mornings by the window, coffee steaming in her hands, watching the gulls fight over scraps. She believed small things mattered, that kindness was never wasted, even when it hurt.
When illness came, it came fast. Hospital bills replaced grocery lists. Fishing trips grew shorter. Nights grew longer. After Ellen was gone, Walter tried to keep going, but grief is expensive in ways no bill ever shows. He sold equipment, missed payments, lost the house. Friends offered help at first, then less, then not at all. Now he lived in a damp trailer near the edge of town, where the mold clung to the walls and the heater coughed louder than he did. The utility notice waited on the table like a threat. If the power was shut off, the cold would become unbearable. Walter stood, lifting the cooler. That fish meant warmth. It meant one quiet meal. It meant survival for at least one more night. As he turned toward the path home, a sound stopped him. Footsteps, slow, uneven, dragging slightly against the wood. Walter glanced back toward the dark end of the pier, where the lights died and the wind smelled sharper, almost metallic. Someone was coming toward him. He emerged slowly from the darkness. He was thin, too thin, wrapped in a threadbare coat that hung off his shoulders like it belonged to someone else. His steps were unsteady, each one careful, as if the dock itself might give way beneath him. When he reached the faint glow of the harbor lights, Walter could see his face clearly. Pale, drawn, exhausted. His hair was dark and matted, damp with sweat or mist. His lips were dry and cracked, and there was a persistent tremor in his hands, the kind that came from deep hunger or lingering illness. The smell of him carried first, cold air, stale fabric, something faintly medicinal. "I'm sorry," the stranger said, his voice barely more than a rasp. "I didn't mean to startle you." Walter tightened his grip on the cooler handle. The stranger's eyes lingered on it just for a second, not greedy, just tired. "I've been walking all day. The shelter's full. They turned me away." He swallowed hard, wincing as if the motion hurt. "I was wondering if you might have anything, even a little food." The sounds of the festival drifted down the pier, music, clapping, a cheer as another firework exploded overhead. Light flared across the stranger's face, catching in his eyes. For a moment, they shone with something Walter couldn't name. Hope, maybe. Walter felt his chest tighten. He thought of the trailer, the cold floor, the dark if the power went out, the ache in his lungs that grew worse when he missed meals. That fish was his plan, his only one. "I don't have much," Walter said, the words heavy on his tongue. The stranger nodded, as if he'd expected nothing else. "I understand," he replied softly. "I wouldn't ask if I had another choice." A gust of wind cut across the dock. The stranger shivered violently, folding his arms around himself. Walter noticed a dark stain at the edge of the man's sleeve, dried blood or rust or both. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Walter could hear his own heartbeat, feel the weight of the cooler pulling at his arm, smell the fish inside, clean, sharp, alive with promise. If he said no, no one would blame him. Survival was reason enough. If he said yes... Walter closed his eyes. Walter opened the cooler. Cold air rushed out, brushing his face. The fish lay inside, silver skin catching the light, its eye dull and lifeless. A single meal, a single night of relief. His hands shook as he lifted it. "I can't offer much," Walter said quietly, his voice rough, "but you can have this." The stranger stared, disbelief flickering across his face. "Sir, are you sure?" Walter nodded. He wrapped the fish back in the newspaper and held it out. As the stranger took it, their fingers touched. The man's skin was ice cold. "Thank you," the stranger whispered. His eyes glistened, not with hunger alone, but with something deeper, gratitude, raw and unguarded. "You don't know what this means." Walter forced a small smile. Inside, fear curled tight in his stomach. He imagined the dark trailer, the empty pan, the cold that would settle into his bones by morning. Still, he said nothing. They sat together on the edge of the dock. Walter tore part of the paper to serve as a plate, breaking the fish in half with practiced hands. He pushed the larger portion toward the stranger. "You should eat," Walter said, slowly. The stranger obeyed. Each bite seemed to steady him, color returning faintly to his face. As he ate, he spoke of nothing remarkable. Roads he'd walked, towns he barely remembered, nights spent listening to the wind. Yet every word carried an unexpected calm, like water smoothing rough stone. Walter listened. For the first time in months, the ache in his chest felt lighter. When the fish was gone, only bones remained, clean and white in the paper. The stranger wiped his hands, then looked at Walter with an intensity that made him uneasy. "You gave when you had nothing," the man said gently. "That matters." Before Walter could respond, the harbor lights flickered. Once, twice, then they went out. The music stopped. Laughter dissolved into confusion. Darkness rushed in, thick and sudden. Gasps echoed across the pier. Walter blinked. When the lights snapped back on a moment later, the dock was empty. The stranger was gone. Only the folded newspaper remained on the bench, warm to the touch. Walter stood alone, the noise of the festival slowly returning around him. People laughed it off, a blown fuse, an old grid, and the music stumbled back to life. Fireworks resumed, bursting across the sky as if nothing unusual had happened. But Walter couldn't move. The folded newspaper rested beside him. He touched it again, still warm. His fingers tingled, a gentle heat spreading up his arm, settling deep in his chest where the ache had lived for so long. He inhaled. For the first time in years, his breath came easily. Startled, Walter coughed once, out of habit more than need. The familiar burn didn't follow. He straightened, realizing his back no longer screamed in protest. The cold no longer gnawed at his bones. A quiet washed over him, not silence, but peace. Walter gathered his things and walked home through the dark streets. The trailer greeted him with its usual damp smell, but when he flipped the switch, the light came on. The heater hummed to life. On the small table lay the utility notice, creased, stamped, final. Beneath it sat an envelope he hadn't seen before. Inside were bills, cash, enough to cover the overdue amount, enough for medicine, enough for food. Tucked between the notes was a simple piece of paper. What you give returns to you multiplied. Walter sank into the chair, hands shaking, not from fear this time, but from awe. Images rushed through his mind, the stranger's eyes, the warmth of his touch, the calm in his voice.
understanding settled gently like dawn. Some meetings are not accidents. Some strangers carry more than hunger. And sometimes the divine arrives not in light, but in need. Walter never missed a chance to help again. He shared what little he had every time without asking who deserved it. The sea still took much from him, but it gave too. And when people asked why he helped so freely, he only smiled. Because once, he said, I fed a man who was starving, and I was the one who was saved. If this story reached you tonight, maybe it's asking something of you. Not belief, not perfection, just compassion. Sometimes that's enough to change everything.